So this is the last stage of our award ceremony. So the Kenneth A. Marantz Distinguished Alumni Award is selected each year, and I might be saying things Kettle's about to say, so I won't say too much. It's selected each year by our graduate students of an alumni from the program. And Dr. Kenneth Marantz and Sylvia Marantz were both dedicated supporters of our department. They attended nearly every Marantz Award ceremony up until Ken's passing in January of 2015. Sylvia passed away 1 year later in January of 2016. Dr. Marantz was chair of this department for a number of years, and their daughter, Susan, usually attends. She lives here in town in Bexley, and she wasn't able to make it today. But I want to continue to thank her and her husband, Roger F. Carroll, for a recent contribution to this fund so that we can continue to offer the award and this ceremony as well. So my very short job, yet again, I just get to introduce people, is to introduce Kettle Patel, who's the president of Arts Priori. You've already heard from her today because she's also the GTA of the Barnett Center and a doctoral student within our program, and she's going to introduce the award.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Hutzel. Pretend all of the graduate student body is behind me because this work is definitely a collective effort of our entire community. I do get the great honor of being able to introduce this award and also our awardee for today. As Dr. Hutzel shared, Dr. Marantz supported this award with our graduate student department. It started in 1984. We're very honored and lucky to be able to continue this work this year and be able to invite an alumni from our program and to be able to share that scholarship over time. And so one of the things that our Arts Priori group is involved in and tries to do each year is to be able to actually vote on various scholars in the field and actually decide who we'd like to invite based on their contributions to the field and the scholarship they've worked on. And we'd like to keep doing that. And so the funding that continues to make this happen is something that we're very proud of. In the past, we've had Dr. Amanda Alexander for last year. Dr. Savage was our 2017 awardee, Dr. Diallo and Dr. Dijon, and then we have Dr. Dewey in 2014. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Melanie Buffington, who was our winner for this year. We were very excited when we got to put out the names and actually have our graduate student body vote. So thank you for joining us and being here. I'll give a little brief introduction of Dr. Buffington. She's an associate professor of art education at Virginia Commonwealth University. She teaches a variety of the undergraduate and graduate courses and used to teach middle school art in Maryland and interned at numerous museums. Is a scholar and published in a number of the journals that are preeminent in our field, and so we're very lucky to be able to have her come and share her scholarship with us. Her bachelor's is from Pennsylvania State University, and her MA and her doctoral degrees are from our institutions. So again, we're very lucky to have someone come and share their scholarship based on the work they've done with us and grown beyond what happens at Ohio State. Her current research interests include museum education, emerging technologies, culturally responsive pedagogy, and contemporary art and public art and service learning. So if everybody can please help me welcome Dr. Melanie Buffington. We are very excited that she accepted the award and that our graduate student body was able to welcome you to be part of this today.
That's okay. Thank you so much for this honor. I really appreciate the recognition from the graduate students, and I'm humbled by this award. It means a lot to me that it was the current students here that who I know are accomplishing really wonderful things. I've seen some of you present at conferences and just seeing the awardees today. And a big thank you also to Brian Javor and Kettle Patel, who helped out planning my trip. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of my current work that brings probably most of this I've been doing within the last year. And instead of just talking about where I am now, I also wanted to look back a little bit and think about some of the things that led me to be where I am today. And so I'm trying to offer a contextualized view of my current research. this article by Mary Hayfley came out a number of years ago in Studies in Art Education, and it's had a really significant effect on me. And for those of you who don't know it, read it. It's a really, in my opinion, it's a really important piece. What she does essentially is she makes note of how we as a field don't recognize our past. So people are doing current work without seeing its relationship to past work. And she's making the larger point that this limits us as a field. And I think that's a really important thing to be aware of as a graduate student and throughout your career, but particularly as a graduate student, is that ideas don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere. And finding ways to recognize the somewhere that our ideas came from and the people who helped us develop those ideas can be really helpful and a really important thing to do. So because this is an article that I revisit over and over, it got me thinking about why I'm doing what I'm doing now. And that led me to reflect back on some of my time at Ohio State. And one of the influences on my current research is the work of Patricia Sturr and her leadership of the department for a number of years. She was one of my professors here, and she was also on my committee. And she taught me a great deal about diversity and about the amount of time it takes to make change. And she, in my opinion, never stopped trying. And this quote is by Dr. Ballinger Morris that Dr. Sturr cited in this article about why does nobody listen to you? And I think that's really important to think about, that sometimes when people aren't listening, we need to think of new ways to communicate and recognize when something isn't working and start thinking about that. So that really got me thinking about diversity. The ideas that a lot of us talk about today in art education are not new. We're very much building on the work of Gloria Ladson Billings and Geneva Gay and James Banks and I'm totally forgetting his first name, Grigsby, Wayne, Eugene. J. Eugene, okay, sorry, I'm confusing people's names. So there's a long history within art education and within general education of people who are saying, why do we keep teaching about white people all the time in schools and particularly in art classrooms? So this led me to think a little bit further. So while we've had some linguistic changes in the ways we talk about diversity, I haven't seen a lot of significant changes in terms of the practices or the resources. Our technology has changed. We have more access to more information now than we have forever, but haven't seen a lot of real change take place. So this led me to think through some of my assumptions. And learning from Dr. Daniel, I adopted the definition of culture as the way we do things around here. So if we think about an expansive view of culture, that is really important. I think we also have to acknowledge, and this is one of my assumptions, systemic racism is real. It exists throughout education and throughout society. You can't look at any public school system without seeing, or I shouldn't say that, you can't look critically at any public school system without seeing and acknowledging patterns of race and racism. The neighborhood that I live in, most of the people look a bit like me or a lot like me, and the schools that the kids go to get more money and more funding than the schools on the other side of town where people look a lot less like me. So if we're going to actually start being honest, we need to acknowledge these things. Part of the reason that this is also tricky is that the vast majority of teachers are white women. So according to the U.S. Department of Education, it stands at 82%. So if we want to talk about culture, if we want to talk about diversity, it's a challenge when we're talking with a very small, very narrow percent of the population. And so I'm got all these ideas kind of swirling around in my head. I know from talking with my students, a graduate student told me this recently, that she was in a class with undergrads, and one of the undergrads told her, this is how you write a lesson. You look on Pinterest, you find something you want to make, then you look on Art 21, and you find an artist whose work looks a little bit like it, and then your professors will let you teach it. And I was like, oh, this is super alarming, but thank you for telling me the truth. And that changed how I thought about some of my practices and recognizing the way that my students are using Pinterest. So I have these, I love Pinterest for recipes. I use it when I'm decorating. I use it in those kinds of aspects of my life. And I had thought, okay, these Pinterest lessons are kind of problematic, but I realized I had to go from this sort of anecdotal dislike of Pinterest for lesson planning to something more scholarly if I want to do more than just preach to my students, but rather engage them in dialogue and understanding. So I came up with this idea of analyzing some of the lessons that I found on Pinterest. And I started with a general sort of spreadsheet analysis, and I thought I was going to knock this out. I was like, okay, I'll do 25 a day, 4 days, I'll get 100 done. This was during the summertime when I had days of time. It was so challenging. It took me weeks to get through 100 lessons on Pinterest, because they were really, really problematic. So as I'm kind of working through this, I read a book chapter by Dr. Acuff, in which she analyzed some lessons on Pinterest, particularly around Native American art, and created these projects that they were promoting. And that got me thinking in new ways. So then I started a variety of different searches on Pinterest. I tried terms like, because I wanted to find the good lessons. I tried culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, all the sort of newer terms. And in some cases I found 0 or 1. None that I found were art specific. So then I kind of realized I had to backtrack a little bit with my language. So even though Pinterest is a newer platform, the language that I had to use was literally the word multicultural. So to me that was an interesting early finding, that what was being promoted on this 21st century platform is sort of a dated version of language and a slightly dated version of thinking about cultures. So what I ended up doing with this study is I analyzed the first 100 lessons that I found on Pinterest with the search term multicultural art lesson. And I had a few parameters. I was not signing up for anything, and I wasn't paying for anything, which I think is kind of how a lot of teachers and museum educators, community arts educators might be working. So I did this. And not surprisingly, these are generally the things that I found. I'll show you a few images and talk through it. One of the things I learned very early on, if you want to teach a multicultural art lesson, you need brown paper. A stunning number of these lessons use brown paper. And that's really kind of interesting if we think, what are the materials that one needs? Okay, so you need brown paper. You also need things to make dots and dabs, not necessarily brushes. So we're using a very limited sort of set of motor skills with these types of projects. So as you probably guessed, on the left, this is, and all of this should be in quotes, an Aboriginal dot painting, and on the right is kente cloth. And the fact that this is not cloth, but actually paper, wasn't addressed. And it's not even kente, exactly. And these types of omissions were not addressed in any of the lessons, with one exception that I'll get to. So essentially, what the lessons were promoting was adult-created childlike representations, which I think is really important to sort of discern that the adult is saying, this is what a kid's version of this should look like. And I'm just making assumptions here, but typically I'm assuming the adults were not from the culture because of the lack of respect shown for the culture. So the next one, there were some 3D projects, toilet paper rolls that were turned into totem poles, and no reflection on the potential disrespect of using a discarded bathroom object to create something with sacred value. So just this kind of project over and over. And what this led me to realize was that I had to develop some criteria for what I thought a good multicultural lesson might be like. And for me, a lot of what it came down to was being specific. So thinking through the people, artists, works, materials, recognizing that you cannot, by any means, even lump together 100 people, let alone thousands, millions, and in some cases, hundreds of different culture-sharing groups, or in some cases, even entire continents. I also thought you need information about the culture. You can't just say, like this next one, we're making Aztec sunstones, and not teach about the Aztec peoples. And the fact that it's not stone also is problematic. But this is, again, what the lessons came up as. It's interesting to me that this teacher had one requirement for this project, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So she had them start off, they're making concentric circles, and they have to draw a face. so there's very little choice there. They do have some freedom here where they get to pick the colors that they put on their sunstone. So the similarity of student work appears to be a goal in this project among many others. And if everyone can take a second and look at the center of these, does anybody see what is going on in the center of the images? Can anybody see? It's a tongue. So the sun is sticking out its tongue. And this is a quote from the lesson. "My only requirement for the sun face is that the tongue is sticking out. On the original ancient Aztec sunstones, it was actually a knife sticking out. FYI, don't tell them this. I tone this down a little and require a tongue to be sticking out." So I have to take a deep breath when I read something like that. So not only is this so alarming in the materials change, but she's changing, she or he, I should say, or they, sorry, they're changing what actually was there in their fake recreation of this thing. And what does that mean? What are we communicating to students? And the idea that someone believes they have the power to change someone else's cultural art form and have children create false replicas of it, in my opinion, is a form of unquestioned whiteness. So that this teacher figure has this power and ability and then is putting this out on the internet is, again, something that I think we need to question. So all of this kind of thing led to how I started the formal analysis of the data. And I looked at all sorts of things like the grade level. Fascinatingly, virtually no multicultural lessons above elementary school. So the idea that multiculturalism is important in elementary, but then really disappears for secondary students. I have no answer as to why, but that was sort of an interesting early finding. I also tried to record the cultures represented, but in most cases they were not recording cultures, they were using countries and or continents. And then that led to the first image that I created from this, and I have details that I'll show you in just a moment. So this is the arrangement by continent of where these 100 come from. So I put the continents in alphabetical order, so it's from left to right: Africa, Asia, Australia, Oceania, Europe, North America, South America that has 0, and then unspecified, which is the people who just said this is a multicultural lesson and then never even specified the culture that it came from. So going to the slightly larger versions, hopefully you can see a little better, the first 3 from the left. Does anybody have any guesses? So we have Africa first. What the majority of the things were from Ghana and Egypt? I'm sorry, yes, the items that would have been purported to be Ghanaian and the items that were purported to be Egyptian. Okay, hieroglyphics, kente cloth, pharaohs, yeah, so the sarcophagus, hieroglyph kind of thing, all of the Egyptian pieces fell in that general category. Kente cloth, and also some were Adinkra symbols. So the only sort of group there is Yoruba, and there's just one lesson that actually addresses a culture-sharing group rather than a country or a continent, which obviously have many, many culture-sharing groups. If we look at Asia, one of the most problematic was the one at the very top, with its China and Japan, where the individual presented those two together. So the students they painted with blue paint Ming Dynasty vases. And I should have checked, but I cannot remember when the Ming Dynasty was. But then they also added Japanese cherry blossoms in honor of the 1912 gift from Japan to the US of the cherry trees. But the Ming Dynasty was not 1912. I just cannot remember.
I'm sorry, I know it's not a question.
That's okay. Yes, okay, perfect. Okay.
Because I'm looking, Yoruba, Africa, Egypt, Ghana, all that stuff is Africa. So I don't understand the designation. I mean, Yoruba, Africa.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is how the people characterize it.
Okay.
So they just use, this is multicultural. They're making African masks is what that Africa represented. So they were saying Egypt is a culture sharing group, Ghana is a culture sharing group. So there's no Tanzania, there's no Mali, there's no Congo, there's nothing. Those were the only specific words that were used.
Well, the mixed bag.
Yes, yeah,
People, continent, country.
right. And then like the,
I'm sorry.
no, that's fine, absolutely. And part of my, just to make a quick tie-in, so that point about Dr. Morris asking Dr. Sturwey, no one listens to her, I'm trying to think of how can we show some of this? So people aren't listening, they're not reading, they're not digesting. So maybe, and one of the things with images, I think, is the dialogue that they can promote that I think is really helpful and useful. So please, if there's other questions, ask along the way. So that point about China and Japan fascinated me. And then the terms like Islamic world and Middle Eastern, they're so vague and broad, as if Saudi Arabia has the same culture as Turkey, as if Iran is the same as Qatar, when they're not. And the most populous nation in Asia, China, has fewer lessons than Japan. And the absence of, there's 44 countries in Asia, and the absence of all the others. Not surprisingly, Australia, Oceania, it's basically Aborigine and lots of dots. That's what you do, evidently, if you're a native person from the Australian region. So then, this was the second half of that chart. Interestingly, in Europe, the Greek ones were all ancient Greek. And then we have two, I think the Russia ones were two from Russia, which were eggs, and matryoshka dolls, and then the rest were just one of each. So it's sort of like, if you think about art history, we have this emphasis on Western art in art history departments and probably throughout many of our backgrounds, yet we're not calling sort of Europe white culture out or understanding it as cultures, which again is another way that not unpacking whiteness is really problematic. So when we get to North America, there are some culture sharing groups, which is somewhat positive. The way they're depicted in the materials that are used are also highly problematic. The complete and utter absence of the continent of South America, something interesting to note. And the whole idea of not specified, that you can say this is a multicultural lesson and never say what the culture is, was something, I was not expecting that. And this was all kind of a surprise to me. But putting it in this format got me thinking in new ways. I spent a lot of last summer counting. So then, what's going on? And I kept wondering, who's missing? So contemporary peoples of the Americas, and Pinterest is based in the US, all my students are based in the US, so it's really interesting that we're not even addressing the contemporary works and contemporary cultures present within the nation where presumably many of the people who generate these lessons live. So these varieties of people are completely absent. One of the other categories I looked at as I was analyzing was, are these historic works of art or contemporary works of art? And I had to invent a category as I got into it. I had to drop the word contemporary, and I went to ongoing because I found nothing that I would actually call contemporary. So something that may have existed in the past and still exists today. And then I had to make up the term fictitious for works of art, as in these things don't exist. But they don't exist in reality, but the teacher invented this thing for this lesson. So an example of some of the fictitious pieces, on the left, these are multicultural dolls, where the children get to pick a culture that they might want to be from and create these stereotypical replicas of this doll. So that's an example of something that I called fictitious because it's not like these cultures actually make these dolls. And the idea of picking culture in that way, I found to be a fiction as well. On the right, this is part of a lesson that someone taught in the Pacific Northwest where she took, she was a teaching artist, and she said she had this on a blog. She did not want people critiquing her choices because she's helping children learn. So I assume she had gotten some critique of taking symbols and saying these were Inuit whales and painting them with acrylic paint on canvases. So she was not pleased, presumably, with that level of feedback. So I categorized that one as fictitious as well. One of the other categories I looked at was, are they naming artists? So who are artists and which cultures are they from? 93 did not identify a specific person, as if everybody in that culture makes the same kind of art. So 7 did identify specific artists, 93 did not. Because I teach pre-service teachers and I work for a state that really cares about standards, I felt the need to look at standards. 96 of the 100 did not have any kind of alignment to standards. 4 did. I also wanted to understand how much information was shared in the lesson. Could you read this lesson, come to some understanding of the culture, and then use it with your students? And very few of them had even a moderate or significant amount of cultural information. Most of them had no cultural information whatsoever, like that Aztec sunstone one that said, this is an Aztec sunstone. It didn't say when they were made, it didn't say why they were made, it didn't say how they were made or what it was used for, but just, this is an Aztec sunstone. So there's very little information about the cultures. A few did actually have links to PowerPoints or other sources of information. One of the other pieces I looked at was the materials, and materials matter. Materials are part of the meaning of works of art. And the idea that you can make a sacred religious ritual related to burial out of a Pringles can is alarming. And I was trying to think of a metaphor. Olivia Goody has shared some ideas, I've heard her present at NAEA and elsewhere, where she talks about, what if we had children make replicas of a cross and then make a replica of themselves and put themselves on the cross and then make little symbols of all their sins and put it around them on the cross? And she's making the point that that's what we do all the time with other people's sacred, cultural, religious objects. And I think that on the left is very much an example of that. And why are we engaging children in making funerary products, basically? Would you have children make a pinch pot for their own cremation ashes one day, or give it to grandma so she can be put in there? I mean, this kind of thing is really horrifying. You can even imagine how many phone calls you might get. And I should say, these practices are not limited to schools. It's very much museums, community art centers, all sorts of places use these same ideas. And on the right, this idea of a dream catcher. Calling it a Native American dream catcher, not saying the specific groups that created dream catchers. You can't use paper plates and strings to make somebody's sacred object. And that's really important to remember, that cultural objects are not out there for other people to take them. So this idea of what are you doing when you're presenting it? I do think a lot of people have good intentions, but I don't think they're putting in the time necessary to reflect. And I think also a lot of that points back on us as people who educate teachers, pre-service, in-service teachers, and thinking about, have we done enough? Are we doing enough? So some of what I've been thinking about this is the importance of accuracy. We really need to stop lying to children when we teach about culture. And that's what we do over and over when we present things as if it is a commodity that you can then own. And one of the points, I discussed this recently in class and used some of these examples, and my students raised a point that I hadn't thought of before, which is the economic aspect of this. So having a child make a Ming vase and take it home with them, Ming vases were not the realm of the everyday people in China. So we're really taking these objects that were for the wealthy, for the elite from these cultures, and we're making these very silly, I would say, pseudo-replicas of them, which is, again, not helping the children to understand what was the life like of an average Chinese person, or what was life like for someone who lived in Tibet. When we use these objects that were the property, literally the property of very few, if you had it and you were not of that class, there could be some significant repercussions. So as I went through all this, I started thinking about posters and other things that teachers use in their classrooms. So curriculum is one part of it, but another part of it is, what do we put up? What do we surround ourselves with? And working with a graduate student and Dick Blick's website, we counted 304 posters that are available on the Dick Blick website that have named individual artists. So there's things like pre-Columbian pottery, but it doesn't have an artist's name, so we didn't analyze those. But we analyzed the ones that had names on them. So the key is here. So those of you, I know some of you are in the back. So the green is white people, men at the bottom, and women are that little bright part at the top. This is Native American, Latinx, Asian, and African American. And those were the races that they had posters of people from those backgrounds. And so you'll notice there's no Asian women, there's no Native American women. Of the 304, 228 are white men, 35 are white women, 16 African American men, 6 African American women, 4 Asian men, 3 Latinx men, and 6 Latinx women. So the grad student and I worked through this quite a bit, and then we realized over and over that the same names were coming up. So for instance, of those 16 African American men, so this is a different type of chart to show this in a different way. 5 of those 16 are Jacob Lawrence. 3 are William H. Johnson. So then we get from 16, but 8 of those 16 are really 2 people. And if you think about the number of women, so there were 6 Latinx women, 4 of those 6 are Frida Kahlo. So the idea of showing diversity, it looks one way when we look at it through one lens, and when we look at it through another lens, it starts to look a little different. So the first image showed a little more diversity, but then when we think about the number of times each person is mentioned, the diversity shrinks a bit. And then that led to the last diagram I have, and while we were working through this, we noticed that some of the poster sets are called masterpieces. So masterpieces of this group, masterpieces of that group. And as I was thinking through that, I read another article by Dr. Acuff that talked about the master narratives of art education. And that really got me thinking about how we use the word master within the arts. So we have old masters, we have masterpieces, we have master narratives. And so this led to our analyzing the subset of posters in these masterpieces collection. So in the masterpieces, there were 24 artists represented. This diagram gets a little more complicated. It's getting at intersectionality, so trying to show that in a visual form took a little while. We probably worked through, I don't know how many versions of this before we got here. So 24 artists are represented. 2 of them are in 2 posters, Matisse and Picasso. So their lines are a little bit wider than well, they're twice as wide as we could tell. And of the masterpieces, 1 person is African American, and that's Jacob Lawrence. So you can see he's purple. So this is race, and then over here we have gender. And 1 person is Latinx, and that's, not surprisingly, Frida Kahlo. And there's 3 women, 2 white women and Frida Kahlo there. So you can kind of see how looking at the data differently gives a different perspective. So when we look specifically at who has access to be called this master, we get a different picture as well. As I was working on this, I reached out to Dick Blick because I think it's sort of unfair to criticize people without giving an opportunity to respond. And I got shuffled around a little bit, and then eventually I got someone who answered my emails, and she told me they don't sell posters on their website. And I wrote back and sent her the links that I was working from, and then I haven't heard back. So now I feel okay. If you're not going to respond, I understand. I was expecting responses like, oh, copyright and all these things, and this is demand. But it was really fascinating that they haven't come back to me. I want to make the point that I didn't create all these on my own. I worked with, the grad student was Kate Duffy, and Eric Johnson works at VCU's library. And we went back and forth over and over to try to get to visuals that a wider variety of people can understand. And I think as we, as a field, are embracing data visualization more and more, it's really helpful and important to have a team. And I also want to make the point that data visualization is not new, and data visualization for social change is not new. If this is something of interest to you, I definitely suggest you look up the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. He did some work in the late 1800s. He was collecting data, and then they were published first in the early 1900s. They're now all freely available through the Library of Congress, and that's really, I've used it in classrooms, so it's a great teaching tool. And Jane Addams also used data visualizations, and they were both working for social change. So they were taking data, putting it in a visual format, and using it to advocate for policy and policy change. So I think that's important to recognize their work as well as many other people. So now, in closing, I'd like to suggest to all the students here that you take a little time, maybe later this afternoon, think about how you came to your ideas. Think about the readings that you've read that influenced you, the classes that you've had that the professors may have influenced you, and take time, send an email to someone and let them know how their work affected you and how it helped you get to where you are today. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have 2 questions about the selection of the Pinterest boards and the selection of the posters. So one for the 100 Pinterest boards, were those like the first 100 that showed up when you typed in multicultural, or how did you find those?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I started with, so my criteria, I wasn't going to join anything. So if it required a login or money, I didn't do it. And it had to have a link to at least a procedure, if not a full lesson. So there's a lot that just have photos and say, this is our third grade show of, oh, there's lots of people who dress up in the clothing of that culture and then have the kids make replicas of it themselves. So if it was sort of just like show and tell, I didn't use those. I had to have some sense of how they got to that. So some version of a procedure or a full lesson plan.
Okay. And then my second question was just, so you were talking about how they even defined a single artist, but also some cultures don't necessarily view art in that way as a single artist. So I guess how were you kind of placing value and considering certain cultures that that's not necessarily important to have that single artist?
I wasn't trying to place value on it, but just more to note it. And that I fully realize, especially with older objects, you know, we don't know who carved that Aztec sunstone. But the lack of connection between something historic and something contemporary was more where I was a little bit troubled, in the lack of connection to students' lives today. So why would a child today care about an Aztec sunstone and no real connection there, or attempt at meaning making? And yes.
Your conceptualization of multicultural was focused primarily on race. And how would you introduce sexuality into this, since a number of your exemplars you pointed out were bi or lesbian or gay artists, and yet that is never given language at all in the way it's approached in public school?
I think that, I'm sorry, could you say the question part again? The first part?
How can you talk about these artists intersectionally so it addresses?
I see. Okay, so one of the things that I've been talking with Kate and Eric about is trying to extend this out and sort of adding another point there. Does that make sense? So looking at people's sexual orientation through the lens of intersectionality even further. A grad student in my department talked about, he went to the Virginia Art Education Association conference, and a teacher presented on Marsden Hartley. And a lot of Marsden Hartley's works relate to his partner. And this student asked the teacher, well, how do you address that? And the teacher said, oh, I would never do that. And that student is working on ideas around, particularly in the elementary classroom. And one of the things that I suggest to students is working with books. So around culture and around sexual orientation, around gender, sexuality. Like the book, Julian is a Mermaid, I think is a really lovely way to address this. I don't know if people are familiar with this book. It's a beautiful picture book, and this little boy is a mermaid and dresses up and does all these actions, and it's I think that could be a really good way, and that's sort of, when you're talking about identity, introducing to students a variety of different ways that artists approach identity and characters that represent identity would be useful.
More than identity, it's just about cultural communities. I mean, there are many different queer communities, and yet it's always focused in on the individual as opposed to looking at the larger meaning of what it means to be a part of it.
I mean, there was nothing that I found on Dick Blick or in Pinterest that addressed sexuality in any way. No discussion of any artists, no. So I think the answer is I really haven't gotten there, because in the sources I was looking at, it's completely invisible. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and even like the absence of the continent of South America. So that's like, there's so many absences when we look at the resources that are free and or inexpensive for teachers. And we all know educators don't get paid a lot of money. So what are you going to do? You can't necessarily buy all these fabulous books put out by every contemporary art museum, take your own photos, create your own images. Instead, people rely on what they have access to.
Just to ask about the absence of South America, I was, as a Brit, I was brought up with the Americas being one continent, and which says something about British education. But I was just wondering about how, at this moment in terms of the US-Mexico border, Venezuela, how is it important to make sure that the separation of landmass and content, in the art room is actually then transmitted into other classroom activities whereby the teaching of the continent actually is a teaching of a certain kind of colonial matrix of power, basically, in order to articulate the continent. And so the kind of, I would actually say a kind of a faux shock that there's nothing in South America. Because actually, if you include Mexico and Guatemala in North America, that's already a problem. So there's something already kind of established in the faux shock of, there's nothing in South America, but actually there's nothing in Latin America, or what is being represented in Latin America is represented in terms of the Northern American view. So I'm just thinking about how this data kind of flows into other lesson plans at the school, maybe even also thinking about things like Black History Month, Women History Month, those kinds of things. How does this kind of relate to other?
And I think that's a good point. I had to make decisions. I was thinking through how to name Australia, because I learned Australia, not Australia/Oceania. So I looked at several different ways of labeling the continents, and I picked one, honestly, that kept, and I think in the US, we typically say Central America is part of North America, which is why I labeled it that way. But I'm well aware that when I was a grad student at OSU, I had a friend from Panama in this department, and she said they only learned one America in Panama. So for her coming to the US and seeing two continents of America was very different. So I had to make a decision somewhere, and that was where I made the decision that Latin America, and like I said, there's many, many varieties of points of view represented, and I had to make a decision. And so I went with one that did the Australia, Oceania, and Latin America as part of North America. I think there's a lot of work that we need to do with regard to state standards, because that's what teachers teach. A friend in Virginia recently pointed out to me that our standards in Virginia, they address ancient China, ancient Greek, ancient Mali, and I'm forgetting the last one, but she said it's basically the study of empire. And I was like, whoa, that is fascinating to think about. And why one empire and not another? And why not contemporary? Why is it all past? So I think a lot of times there's so much pressure, particularly on the elementary art teachers, to teach tied into what they're learning in their social studies class. So that is where, one of the places where I see advocacy and policy making, particularly from higher ed, that could help that if we can get in there and crack open some of those standards a little bit, that's what teachers have to write to in terms of their lessons and teach to. And when we can put ourselves in there, whether it's volunteering for, I'm sure, what is a never-ending committee. I'm currently debating if I want to volunteer for the rewrite of Virginia Standards of Learning. But it's probably worth it, but I think it will be painful. But that's one of the things that I think there is a responsibility of policymakers and people in higher ed to be part of that. It's really easy to be like, these teachers, they don't do these things. It's another thing to try to help get in there and say, look at the power structures and why do they make these choices? Why are people all over Virginia teaching about Mali and not any other country in Africa? It's because in third grade they're required to learn it. I try to point out the connection to Amina Robinson's work, the King Abu Bakari. So like, yeah, you can teach about Mali, but you can teach about it through a contemporary artist and help students see the connection to their lives and their world. You could actually bring in literature, all the books that she has. So there's ways, I think, around that, but I think that's part of a responsibility of people in higher ed and in policy to help with that.
I think you made a really good point when you were asking, you made many good points, thank you. When you were asking why none of this material related to secondary education to high schoolers. I think there are probably a lot of theories about why, and you probably have your own theories, but mine is probably similar to yours. That when teenagers, you start engaging teenagers, they have opinions, and they have lives, and they're going to start asking questions about why this and why not that, you know, or I don't like this, and this is why, and that sort of thing. So it's messy.
Absolutely.
It's messy. So there's your next piece of research.
Oh, yeah. I think that's but I think that's a really good point. And one of the things I hear a lot from my students is, well, high schoolers need skill. And that's how you get them to their AP portfolio. That's how you get that good score. That's how you get them into college. And so they're prioritizing sort of Western elements and principles type practice over understanding, rather than seeing that you can teach skill in a variety of ways. And
business school here at one point turned down applicants who did not have any cultural life.
oh,
That
interesting.
did not understand anything about the world, even though they might have had great scores and so forth. They're saying, yeah, but you're hollow
Right.
in this respect. So, you know, if that's the kind of motivation they're looking for, you might want to just add that to the list, you know, things to do.
List of reasons. Okay, that's a good point. Thank you. And there was someone.
I was just saying, one reason probably is the thing from earlier is that generalists in elementary education, they teach about multiculturalism and specialists do skills.
Oh, that's a good point too. Yeah.
I loved the visuals. I know we talked briefly last night that you were going to have a lot of visual, but I think this is really amazing, the stuff that you're doing and trying to visualize and make concrete in these ways. I think it does make the data much more meaningful, much more understandable, and I think it almost makes it actionable. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
So do you have an answer to Dr. Valentin Morris's question?
Oh, why is nobody listening? I think what we're doing, and I've been thinking about this a lot, is cute replicas, and they're not even replicas of real things. It's sort of, I think it goes back to Eflin's idea, school art. Like, I think there's a subset of school art that is these cultural product type things. I think there's something really powerful in this idea that you can own this object, like, and take it home with you. Like, no one would actually have a totem, or typically would not have a totem in their bedroom, but we can make it sort of like commodifiable, and someone can own it. And there's something in that, like this power and desire in a capitalist society to own, to take away, to have for yourself. So I don't know if that gets at that people don't want to question that. Maybe we shouldn't be able to own everything we want to own. Maybe we need to recognize that some things aren't for us. We can understand, we can appreciate, we can look at it, but maybe we can't or shouldn't try to own it. So I don't think I have an answer yet, but I'll keep thinking.
Do you tell your students not to use Pinterest anymore, or what's your policy on Pinterest?
Well, first of all, I recognize that it doesn't really matter what I say, because they're going to do what they're going to do when I'm not there. But one of the things I've had them do is deconstruct these lessons. So, for instance, that point about the Ming vases, that came from my students on Monday, that people couldn't have had access to this. So I'm trying to show them Pinterest and show them some of what they find on it. So hopefully, they reacted. I had them look at the Ming vases, the Chinese-Japanese one, a sarcophagus one, and I'm forgetting the third. Oh, the sunstones, yes. So they were horrified. And they're like, this teacher shouldn't have done that. Look how bad this is. We can do better than this. So I'm kind of trying to take that approach to maybe get them to say, I don't want this, rather than, but like I said, I realize they're going to do what they're going to do, regardless of what I tell them. But if I help them see why they can and should do better by their students, I think that might be more productive. But I'll let you know.
Thank you, Melanie.
Oh, my pleasure.
Great having you here. I get to give out this very small token award each year. I'll hand it to you.
Oh, thank you.
So, the we have 200 copies of this fable that was authored by Ken Marantz and printed upon his retirement in 1999. The image was by Sidney Shavitz, who started the OSU printmaking program, and he passed away in 2013. And an aside, Sidney Shavitz went to school the same time City Gluck did, who I sent the faculty a video of recently. She's leaving a scholarship to our department in a planned giving. She's 97 years old and a Holocaust survivor, and I visited her last month for the first time, and she has an image by Sid Shavitz as well, and said that they were often mixed up because they both sort of have a very similar name. So I thought that was a really interesting connection again to our department in the art department. So I normally read this. I feel like I've read it so many times. I'm going to leave it back to you. But I also want to add, so Logan Elm Press is the printmaking press that printed this. And we just got an email this month that from AFC leadership that they're officially closing Logan Elm Press. So I think it's kind of a fitting thing for me to share that. It was a joint college collaboration between the College of Arts and Sciences and university libraries. Their printing operations had been suspended since 2015. But the leftover Logan Elm Press development funds and I think the actual printing presses are going to be transferred to the Department of Art, so they can continue to support the printmaking program in that department as well. So Melanie, thank you. I also just want to add, and I didn't say this to you personally, that I'm a real fan of the way you approach research in the field. You're very methodical about the research that you do, and I think it adds some really important and necessary research that we can point to that we often make assumptions about. And so I just want to add that I really appreciate it. We use your book in our research course, the book that you and Sarah wrote, edited, and I just want to thank you for that too. So this concludes our award ceremony today as well. Thank you all for coming. I hope you have a nice weekend, and we'll see you next week.